How's everyone doing?
Good.
Good. Okay. All right, so we're going to start today with my favoriteest guest of all time, Prince. And Prince will share some of his own thinking and research and work on some of what I had introduced in the last class about land loss, black land loss, but specifically among the Gullah Geechee in the southeast part of the U.S. Of course, this is, last week we were talking about forms of joint tenancy, right? And we sort of spoke about partition and the way in which partition might render certain descendants, right, vulnerable to forms of land loss, and that's part of what I hope you saw in the documentary, right? You all saw the short documentary, and what Prince will also talk about. And then after Prince concludes, we'll return to our material on marital property. Okay?
Yes.
All right, and then I will let Prince more fully introduce himself, but I just want you to know that I am always so honored to have Prince join us.
Thank you so much, Professor Munshi. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, if I click, yes, it's perfect. Okay. So I am A. Prince Albert III. Okay, I am an alumnus of the Georgetown Law Center in 2020. I've had many lives before and since law school, doing various things, but right now I am the president of Goldwater Ventures. It's a consulting partner for mission-driven organizations and social entrepreneurs worldwide. We empower people to solve social problems. Social impact is just an inherent part of who I am and what I've done with my whole life. And I continue to do that. As you'll also see, I'm the co-founder and the chairman of the board of directors for the Gullah Geechee Cultural Community Trust. We'll talk more about that at the very end, okay? But this is who I am. Professor Munshi again has given me the distinct honor of presenting to you all a very niche area of law and culture that is very near and dear to my heart. Land loss among and in my community. I am Gullah Geechee. My family is from the southernmost sea islands, the Amelia Island Inlands. I grew up in Philadelphia, but every summer for the first 18 years of my life, and many of the years since the first 18 years of my life, I went down to stay with my grandparents in South Georgia and Northeast Florida. I tanned to a color unrecognizable and got all kinds of nettles and things stuck in my feet and cactus needles in my shirt and shoes, playing with my cousins outside. We would go hiking, hunting, crabbing, fishing, anything you can imagine, doing the things that my ancestors have done in this area for hundreds of years. And really it is during those summers where I spoke and heard Gullah bedtime stories, riddles, colloquialisms, some of them I might accidentally and unconsciously use here. But please join me in this journey because I want your help to brainstorm some of the ways that we can stop my community's land loss, okay? Okay? Great, thanks guys. Okay, so first we're just gonna do a brief overview of Gullah Geechee history and identity. I do want to know, since we're in law school and we all geek out on the law, I do want to talk about some of the legal recognition that the Gullah Geechee community has. Then we'll talk about the Vice News video that kind of set up how Gullah Geechee people went from being property to owning property, and then from owning property now to losing property. We're going to look at the ways of what I call legal divestment, right? These legal tools that actually aid in divesting Gullah Geechee communities. Then we'll talk about some legal remedies and just have an open-ended discussion. I'll also stick around for the break.
Yes, I mean, if you're willing to do that, yeah.
Sure.
Then if you have, more questions for Prince, we can keep talking during the break. Yeah.
Absolutely, so I'll stick around for questions and whatnot. Okay, so the Gullah Geechee people, we are descendants of West and Central Africans who were captured enslaved, and transported to the southeastern islands of the United States between 1525 and 1866. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, 12.5 million Africans were captured and destined for the Americas, both North and South. Only 10.7 million survived in that voyage, and from those 10.7 million, only 388,000 or so were sent to North America. And 55% of those 388,000 came through the port of Charleston, South Carolina, right? And this is a way we start understanding Geechee culture. American enslavement in particular was reliant on breeding. Okay, so they were really reliant on getting slaves over here. It was so costly that they did not want to keep risking a constant influx of slaves and rely on that system. They would bring them here and really subject these humans to very dehumanizing and unhuman conditions to make more slaves. Right? So, really, the Gullah Geechee area that we understand it now, right, spans from the tip end of North Carolina, what we call Jacksonville, North Carolina, to Jacksonville, Florida, where my family's from on the most southern coast. And really, Gullah Geechee culture emerges from so many groups that, came from Western and Central and even Southern Africa, and actually intermarried with indigenous people in the United States, as well as the unfortunate histories that we know about the abuse of slaves as well. But really, there is an indigenous history that is really important in Gullah Geechee culture and life. And for the first time in this lecture, I'm going to ask more about that and kind of press more about that at the end when we talk about legal recognition and indigeneity, okay? But when we talk about law recognizing identity, right, where does Gullah Geechee culture history first start getting recognized? We look at in 1865, during the American Civil War, General Sherman, who was a Union general, he issued Special Field Order number 15. How many of you have ever heard of Special Field Order 15? Tell me what you know about it.
It basically took land from, it took the land that Southern planters had, and it was promised to former enslaved individuals in blocks of 40 acres. And it was to basically transfer former enslaved people into productive farming, agricultural society. Right,
that's right. So essentially, as you mentioned, the 40 acres and a mule came from this order. It was actually an order that was passed right after the Civil War, because really the context, I'll get a little more into the context. It was an understanding that, wow, we have subjected these people of African and indigenous descent to incredibly terrible, horrific, inhumane conditions. They will not want to live with us. We will not want to live with them. So we're just going to give them their own land, and maybe they'll be happy doing the things that they have always known how to do for themselves: hunting, fishing, farming, okay? So it was this idea of, yes, it has a reparative quality to it, but it was also meant to just kind of like cage African Americans to a place where they won't be a problem or want to kind of retribute against the people that enslaved them.
Can I suggest something also? Because
Sure.
if you remember from our early discussions in the class too, we talked about like the homesteading acts too. So it's not that this was some original kind of like form of repair that was contemplated.
Right.
Like, you know, the Oregon Land Donation Act sort of freely gave 100 acres
Right.
at a time to,
That's
you know,
right.
families who were willing to cultivate. So it's not, you know, like the 40 acres and a mule is not such an extraordinary kind of like achievement of the imagination, right? The U.S. was freely really giving away land to white people at the same time, right?
That's exactly right, and I think it's important, I'll mention the Homestead Act a little
Okay.
later, which is great. But what's important about that is 160 acres were given to white families to relocate westward, but only 40 acres were given to 40,000 black families statutorily, right? But we know that no one ever got their 40 acres and no one ever got a mule because President Andrew Johnson revoked the act. Pretty much a year after President Lincoln was assassinated, he became president and pretty much annulled it. No one ever got their 40 acres. Okay, the second law, right, that I want to think about is something called self-determination, nationhood. Can anyone tell me about self-determination? Anybody take an international law?
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay. We're not on electives yet, sorry, y'all. Rushing y'all. Okay, so self-determination is when a people with a distinct culture, history, in a certain place, declare themselves their own people, right? Self-determination is one of the beginnings of statehood or nationhood. So on July 2nd in the year 2000, the Gullah Geechee Nation declared its self-determination, okay? It was a culmination of the election and the installment of Quinquet, someone you've heard before, someone we'll talk about a little later. The area that becomes now the Gullah Geechee Nation in 2000 is the area that roughly amounts to Sherman's Special Order number 15. Okay, that's why it becomes important. It is our in-group reclamation of what was denied from us by President Andrew Jackson. Okay, and the Gullah Geechee Nation is also represented in the United Nations. We participate in the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, also work with UNESCO on the Decade of African Descent that has now been extended a number of years, and sustainability goal setting and things like that because of climate change that really ravages and threatens our area and our ways of life. We're also really contributing to those discussions, not just on a national, but on an international level. In fact, next month, a delegation of us from the Gullah Geechee Nation will be in attendance at the UN Ocean Decade Conference in Barcelona. Okay, so we are very much active at the UN level. But also we have the federal recognition. The Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Act. I messed up my slide, but I'll tell you all about it. And I will send you a different slide that has all the information. Okay. But in 2006, Congress enacted the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Act. This led to the establishment of something called the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. It is a federal body that is meant to recognize and preserve Gullah Geechee culture. The law also kind of allocates certain congressional funds to development, visiting, right, tourism and all these things, and different kinds of studies and congressional research projects to kind of archive and preserve Gullah Geechee history. Now there is some tension, right, between this idea of federal recognition and of a group recognizing itself, okay? So we'll maybe talk about that on the break, but these things matter, and they do matter even in an international, national, and a local, right, or self-determined level. Okay, when we talk about land, right, land is considered to us an ancestor. Land is God's gift to us. It is a place of refuge and sustenance for Black people. And it is particularly important now when so many places barely or merely tolerate Black people, particularly in my state, in Florida. These islands were places of refuge and safety and sustenance for us for almost 500 years. When you Google Gullah or Geechee people, you often see like enslaved people or former enslaved people. You'll see people dressed in traditional clothing or African clothing. Some of that is authentically us and our cultural retentions, as what I'm wearing today. Some of that is also a little inauthentic, right? It's something that people are doing to connect to roots or maybe to even ascribe themselves into the Gullah Geechee history after having been disconnected from it, okay? But I want to show you what Gullah Geechee people really look like, right? And how we really exist in day to day. They look like me, they look like us, and this is my family. So now, you all saw the Vice News documentary about Gullah Geechee land dispossession. And I like this video because it's a great visualization of what land loss looks like on the ground, right? It isn't this big congressional battle happening in courthouses. It's happening on the ground, on lots of land, on dirt roads, on waterfront properties, on resorts, every single day. And so I want to talk about the actors in this saga, right? Who are some of the actors and what are their roles? Who are some of the people that you remember from the Vice News video? Yes?
Real estate developers or maybe people who are looking at the land as like a way to make profit.
That's right. Who else do you remember? Even if you don't know names, tell me just the roles that they played.
There was an attorney.
And
He just knew a lot about like the historical property rights of the Gullah Geechee people and how it might conflict with other people trying to buy land.
Anybody else? Yes.
Well, there are tons of telepathic tourists.
Tourists, yeah, it's a huge part of it. A double-edged sword, right? How so?
Well, I mean, the video shows sort of the ways that the tourism industry has led directly to the dispossession of Gullah Geechee land and the legacies of enslavement, just really front and center, naming everything plantation and
Right.
I'm sure.
Excellent. Now I've heard about all the bad guys and one good guy. Are there other good guys? What about the Gullah Geechee people themselves? I see you nodding your head.
Well, yeah, I think that we thought it was too obvious, but obviously it's the Gullah Geechee and they are the main actors in this.
That's right. I think a lot of times people talk about our land, but don't talk about us. We're very active, right, in our community and saving our land. Let's go through the actors in particular, because I want to refresh your memories and I don't want you to lose this, because these actors really are inherent all up and down the coast. It's just a great visualization of it, okay? Who is this? The woman on the right. I mentioned her already. Yes, sir?
Queen Quet,
Yes. And who is Queen Quet?
leader.
She's the chiefess of the Gullah Geechee Nation, right? The head of state of the Gullah Geechee Nation I just mentioned. She was the one that was installed on July 2nd, 2000. This is her, right, front and center in her community. She's from Hilton, she's from St. Helena Island, which is a very, very important and gorgeous island. It is what we call the cultural seat of the Gullah Geechee Nation. Okay? It's right next to Hilton Head, actually. And she's the founder of the Gullah Geechee Sea Island Coalition, which is important because before we called Gullah people Gullah, Geechee people Geechee. She put Gullah and Geechee together for the first time when she made an AOL chat group in 1996. I don't even think y'all were around in 1996. But literally, she was the first person to put those terms together and found the Gullah Geechee Sea Island Coalition, which is the first Gullah Geechee organization in the world. Okay. Who is this? Sarah.
That's the attorney. I don't know his name though.
Willie Hayward, okay? He's the head of the Heirs Property law firm, right? They work explicitly on behalf of Gullah Geechee people and other people who have heirs property problems. Now, I want you to know all Gullah Geechee land issues are not heirs property issues. Okay? While that is a big part of our fight and what has historically gotten us to this moment of great loss, it is not the only ways we lose land. Okay? But this is important here. Who is this? The real estate developer. Is he a good guy or a bad guy?
I think he's a bad guy.
And why?
Because some of the ways that he portrayed the Gullah Geechee people were just culturally insensitive. Like I think I'm gonna paraphrase, but I think one of the things that he kind of said was, like, either get with the times or we're gonna take land from you and we're gonna develop it and profit off of it, basically.
Right. Is he Gullah Geechee?
Yes, yes.
He is, right? So just because you're Gullah Geechee doesn't mean you want your community to keep its land, right? You may also be an actor in the divestment, right, of our land, right? And we'll talk more about that when we talk about heirs. So his name is Adolph Brown. He's a real estate broker, slick-talking New Yorker, right? Whose family is from Hilton Head, and he returned to Hilton Head to cash in, okay? Who is this? I'll help you out. Who remembers the role that he played? Someone I haven't talked to. Yes.
I know he lives on like the Gullah Geechee land and has lived there for a long time. He's kind of resisted the efforts for his land being bought, and has kind of been fighting back against that while he's lived there.
So he is a Gullah Geechee elder, right, Mr. Lawrence, and he is protecting his land. Okay. We see other members of the community, right? How did Gullah Geechee people acquire land? First, Sherman's Special Order number 15, but then they lost it, right? So it was this acquisition, but it really didn't take effect. But really, the number one way Gullah Geechee people got land is not a handout. It's direct purchase. They worked on the lands, right, that they were once enslaved on, and they purchased property from white folks who abandoned the area, didn't want to be there, fearing that black people would retribute against them, etc. You also have wills, gifts, bequeaths, right? Times when enslavers essentially gifted their land to enslaved people because they loved them, right? They were parts of their families, believe it or not. Land allotments, homesteading that we mentioned, as well as inheritance, right? You can also get land through inheritance. As we know, a lot of the land in the Gullah Geechee area gets handed on from family member generation to generation without wills intestate, and that is the origin of our problem. Now, the legal ways that Gullah Geechee people are divested of land. Number one, I would say, is actually tax hiking, right? Taxes go up and up and up arbitrarily for no reason. It is a form of gentrifying. It is a form of getting people's lands efficiently and quickly sold to developers who know how these online auction systems work, right? Partition, as we mentioned, you get your Adolph Brown and the family, right? And you get them to force the family to bring it to sale, right? Just like in Arkland Co. Eminent domain is something that the Biden administration right now is talking more about. Literally where the government just said, we're gonna put roads here. So the government takes the land, no one enjoys the land other than the highway, but these people don't get to enjoy it. And that could have been the point, right? Adverse possession, right? Where family members are living distantly, so they're not in touch with their land, and after 7, 9, 10 years, next thing you know, that land becomes someone else's, right? And then other predatory practices, right? Things that are legal, but really these kind of real estate developers doing things that are coercive, that under contract terms could be illegal, right? But on paper are legal and are very, very hard to prove. Okay, how big is the problem? It's humongous, right? Black-owned farmland, almost a third of it is heirs property, and over 3.5 million acres that was worth more than 28 million has been lost, right? And we can see that black involuntary land loss, the Department of Agriculture studied way back in like 2012, 2013, and really they found out that African Americans have lost almost 90% of their farmland. So what we are fighting for on islands like St. Helena, like Amelia Island, like Hilton Head, are the remnants, right, of what we have left, the 10%. I'll skip over this and you guys can read this because I'll get Professor Munshi to post it. And any legal remedies. Now I'm gonna help you out. If tax hiking is a problem, what could be a legal remedy to tax hiking?
Do you want to explain what tax hiking is?
Oh, sure,
Yeah,
yes.
how it works. Yeah.
Tax hiking is essentially when property taxes are a certain amount, but the people who, the elected officials, right, who are assessing property taxes, just start escalating year after year the property tax amount. They assess plots of land at higher and higher rates when they become more, the area becomes more desirable. But it's also a tactic of getting people out, right? So if property taxes were once $800, next year they're $1,600, 2 years from now they're $4,000, then they go as high as $10,000, $12,000, even higher, right? People can't afford it. After about 2 or 3 years of going into default, the land is up for sale just for the amount of taxes owed. So you could get hundreds of acres of land for dirt cheap relative to its worth because people can't pay. Does everybody understand that? Essentially, that's tax hiking. We can see how tax hiking, this arbitrary, right, raising of taxes, it gentrifies communities, it changes communities. So what would be a remedy, a legal remedy, to stopping tax hiking? If taxes are going up, what can maybe the law or policy do?
Tax ceilings.
Ceilings, right? Some kind of way of relief or an incentive or a ceiling of tax hiking. Also, there have been cases. There was a case called the Sapelo Island case, right? Where really the Department of Justice weighed in on Sapelo Island and the, I believe it was Camden County, that essentially was arbitrarily raising taxes, but they didn't see why they were raising the taxes. Bridges were falling apart. No, I know it's very soon. And right, infrastructure was falling apart. So why are you raising the taxes, right? It has a predatory, right, value to it because there's no real value that we're seeing from the tax hike. Partition. What's a way you can stop partition? This is a hard one because it's a property right. But what are ways that you might address partition from a policy standpoint? Yes.
Essentially making it, especially in heirs property cases, making it more difficult for like one party to force like a partition to happen, or giving people who live on the land potentially getting stronger like recognition of their like ties.
Interesting. So one of them you said, the first one was adding friction to the process. Exactly, okay. There's something called the Uniform Partition Heirs Property Act that can't stop landowners from exercising their rights, but puts friction in the process. I love that. It also, it's not explicit in the law, but I think plaintiffs are sympathetic when they do live on the land, right? When they've been taking care of the land for some time, while that may not have explicit legal remedy in some states, and in some cases, it does have some weight, okay? I'll help you guys out. Eminent domain, right? Ways to maybe stop or address this going on into the future might be zoning or land use regulations, right? Instead of the government using its power to take land away from people or displace people from land. The government might use its power to protect land, right? To zone land. And adverse possession and other predatory practices, right? We might think of legal assistance and education programs. I'm really gonna tell you though, it's legal assistance. It is very hard to find a lawyer besides our heirs property attorney, Mr. Lawrence, right? It's very hard for them, excuse me, Willie. It is very hard for them to find lawyers to help us, right? Lawyers are very hard to come by because they work for big corporations. Lawyers want to work for money. We don't necessarily have the money because we're trying to save something of value and we're cash poor in doing it, right? So one of the last things I want to leave you with, right, is trust. Trust is really needed in these situations to really stop black land loss and maybe even inspire people to come back and to help our cause and to reinvest in communities in the South that have these strong African American and Gullah Geechee cultures and traditions. So we started the Gullah Geechee Cultural Community Trust. It operates for a number of ways and a number of purposes. One of them is most obviously a trust. One of the ways we figured that we could help is starting a trust where people who are on shaky grounds about whether they know the land will stay in their family or not can give their property, right, after their passing or in their will to our organization, and we will be stewards of it, right? We work with a variety of families on different ways that we do that. It's a very interesting thing to really work with different families because really it may not even be about receiving their land. It may be doing some of that legal education, helping them even write a will to keep it in their family. Maybe helping them turn some of their informal farms into companies, right, or LLCs that have favorable tax rates, things that you'll learn later in corporations. So there are ways that we can help people meet their goals instead of just imprinting, right, one solution for everyone. And we certainly don't want to become a menace in Gullah Geechee land loss through this veneer of helping the community, right? We're very, very cognizant as co-founders of that. So I leave you with that. I thank you guys for your time. I'm happy to hear your thoughts, questions, or suggestions about ways that we can help save our land. And thank you for your time. Thank you,
Let's take a
Professor
couple
Munshi.
questions. Let's take a couple questions and then we can take an early break. Yeah,
Thank you.
good?
Yeah.
That's good.
Yes, sir.
Does heirs property make it difficult to convey land into a trust?
Yes.
So how do you go about that?
Literally. Literally. First of all, one of the things that we have to do by default as an organization doing this work, we've got to really be in touch with historians, right? Local people who know families and who know maybe they have a phone number or a yearbook or an email or like an Ancestry.com hit that can help us find all of someone's heirs. People may not even know all of the members of their families, but an elder neighbor might remember that one of them kids grew up and went to the military and then got out of the military, so we might have to go and had to go to military records to find people's children or grandchildren from World War I or II or Vietnam, etc. So really, actually, one of the first things that we do is really offer services to families to help them find all of their heirs and help them package and communicate options to the heirs, right? Really just helping them streamline that instead of leaving it all up to them to explain legalese that they might barely understand. And I also want to take off the burden of you don't know your rights, that's why you're losing your land. Like, that's victim blaming, right? These things are very complicated and systemically and inherently complicated on purpose, right? To prevent people to understand what's going on so that they cannot assert their rights. So, we really approach legal education in a way of inviting people to learn more, not blaming them for not knowing, because the system was not designed for us to know. Yes, sir.
You mentioned this at the beginning of the lecture, like the relationship with indigeneity, and I was hoping you could flesh that out a little more, considering a lot of, I assume the land that the Gullah Geechee claims now was once claimed by Native American groups, so I was hoping if you could talk a little bit more through like the tension and maybe collaboration with Native American groups in the area.
Sure. First, I'll say it's really a story of collaboration for the most part, right? Native groups in North Carolina, especially South Carolina and even Georgia, right? We maintain contact with, and some of them are our relatives, right? Literally. So, and there are, other groups. I think other indigenous groups, I won't mention them by name, are more hostile, right? They see that Black people got a whole bunch of problems in the United States. They got their own problems. They don't want to team up and take on the baggage of more problems, okay? So there's a coalition building problem because Native groups have been taken advantage of so much. They just don't want to, they view alliance, right, and allegiance as a risk. That's unfortunate. I don't think that's the case, or I hope that won't forever be the case, but I can understand their reticence, right? I think you have some areas, for example, on my home island and on Amelia Island, the Timucua, right? The Timucua Indians are no longer. We are their descendants. We are their relatives, right? So there may be a way, as you're alluding to, for us to assert some kind of right in their stead as their descendants, right? For some of those indigenous rights. And that's something that we're thinking about as well. We're also fighting an issue on burial grounds, where our burial grounds are threatened to be developed. I've done a lot of personal research on this with some archaeologists at FPAN and other places, right? And they tell us that Timucua burials are right near Gullah Geechee burials. In fact, Timucua Indians in particular buried their ancestors right next to water. A lot of times that water has receded, and then we buried our ancestors either on top of their ancestors or right next to their ancestors, probably because they were related and they took up that practice. So there may be a way, as we recognize indigenous spaces, we bring Afro-Indigenous groups into this conversation. And there's a hemisphere-wide movement toward Afro-Indigenous, right? Recognition and cooperation. I do that in my firm as well. Yes?
This is more of a hypothetical, but if the government were to, as restitution, give the Gullah Geechee people land in some other part of the country, would the community be receptive to starting over?
Probably not, because when we talk about the blood, sweat, and tears, and really where our culture lives, like when you think about our lore, it's the animals, right, that are often like the stars of our lore and our stories. So if you bring us to another area of the country or even of the world, we don't even have the same animal. We're talking about animals that don't even exist anymore. We're talking about, types of flora and fauna that don't exist. So I don't think anyone would be receptive to that. And you got to think, right, the African Americans in this country, in terms of population, are most concentrated in the areas where we were enslaved. Why should we continue to move about and move and, when we worked here and we lived here and we contributed here, right? We're not saying we want it all to ourselves and no one else, but like, why should we leave home, right? Because we've made this home too. Yes?
I would imagine that these are really hard conversations to have with families about using their land, about intergenerational wealth building. How do you build trust when you're starting conversations, especially for baby lawyers as they're thinking about going into different realms of property?
Sure. Number one, you have to be from the community. So I am Gullah Geechee, right? I work with folks that have lived in the community longer than I've been alive, like multiples over my lifetime. And really, it is them. They are the champions. They are the trust builders that really allow me to translate on their behalf, right? They allow me to, and I believe this is a strength of mine, something that I've always tried to do through my legal education. And those who come from communities and want to do that work, I implore you to do the same. Nothing in the law is really complicated. It's not, right? It's just explaining it in a way that people can understand it. We use complicated language, all this policy rationale, blah, 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 all these fancy words, but really it's quite simple, right? There is a real piece of property, land, even that term is like real property, it's like medieval term, like why, okay? But there is land in question and there are options you can do with your land, right? There are ways that you can own it or transfer it or re-own it in a different way, right? That might give it survivability. So if any of you want to work in any communities, right? If they're your own, lead with love and compassion and connection. If you're not from that community, partner with those who are from that community. I hope you also mean well to that community by asking them how you can help them and not just railroading them with your will. Some families want to sell their land. Some families know they live up north, they're never going back, but they might be able to sell to us because what they want is the windfall, right? And that's okay. We're not gonna tell them you can't sell it because if you want to sell it, you're a landowner, you can do that, but we just implore you to think of the community before and as you do that.
Let's take one more question and then we can keep going during the break. Yeah.
Yes,
I'm
sir.
gonna answer a bit at the end, but I'm kind of curious, considering the real estate broker and the fact that he's a descendant of the Gullah Geechee Nation and is engaging in the possession and exploitation of this community, is that like a trend that you've seen or a pattern among descendants of the community who kind of, they live in New York or Chicago or elsewhere?
It happens. It's not very common, but there's an Adolph Brown in every community. Really though, one of the things that I am really interested in doing more is like, how can we are an oral people, right? So when we need to empower grandma and grandpa to sit around and to tell the family what they intend to do with the property, right? But we also encourage folks to record those interactions and maybe do both, right? So have a video recording of that interaction, as well as have, your witnesses or whatever present, right, to also kind of witness that transaction. So the legal instrument and the evidence of, right, it is concurrent, right, and could be used as evidence. And we've actually dealt with families that have successfully used that tactic, right, that I was able to think about. But really, I think that line of thinking is effective for someone like Adolph Brown when you have the entire family who witnessed and heard and know what grandma or grandpa's intentions were, and you are actively going against it. That adds a kind of like consciousness and a moral and ethical friction to just doing it. Right? You can do it anyway, but you know the harm that you're causing because we clarified, right, the legal instrumentation and like the purpose of this contract or covenant or will or bequeath.
Good?
Yes.
Yeah, and you can, you're available.
Alright, let's take a break and then we can talk to friends.
Hello.
Well, I'm not a decade listening, but my family moved like about half from back to
Somebody's phone down the floor. Hey, should I pick it up? Huh? Maybe we're supposed to. I mean, not my business at all. But I was no, it's
oh yeah, we own that land by the king. She's like, what king? Oh, the Queen of England in 16 whatever. And all the county names are all named after random English lords and whatever. And then like we talk about like it's not even that like indigenous communities were pushed out of those lands in the 1600s and 1700s in the period. And I just think it's very, like, I'm wondering how you're also grappling with like Florida fighting against public education, like South Carolina, North Carolina, also thinking it's like accurate tellings of those histories. Because I feel like they're so erased. Even thing from like Wilmington, like insurrection that like, you know, just or toppled the Bible government. Like there's so many parts of that history that are totally erased. I'm just wondering, sorry, as a one bank about it, like, how are you grappling with that sort of accurate telling, even get people to understand the context of what's going on?
Sure, if I may, can somebody pass me my phone?
Oh, yeah,
This
yeah,
one?
sorry.
Yes, yes, thank you.
Sorry, no.